gang, Rodin here. Welcome on back to the Retrocade, and welcome to another edition of Sports Saturday. And for this week, as we find ourselves now officially in the dog days of summer, we're going to go back to 1999 and the Nintendo 64, and we're going to play WCW Mayhem Wrestling. Now, why are we doing this? Well, a couple of reasons. One, because in going back through my list of the various games that we have played, we actually have not played a wrestling game since our initial episode in this series being Pro Wrestling for the Nintendo Entertainment System. And we did that for a reason, because I said at the time that it is still, nearest makes no difference 40 years later, the best wrestling game ever made, top to bottom. And I am prepared to defend that hill, and if necessary, potentially die on it. But I need to do so by showing an example, and doing that will be through a game like this. Now, what we're going to do over the next half an hour or so is we're going to put this game to the test, and I did not have a Nintendo 64 growing up. I again went from the Nintendo to the PS1, so I completely skipped the 16-bit generation and went straight to the 32-bit generation. That also means I didn't have an N64, and I also didn't know anybody who had an N64. So I think I'll take Bret Hart because he was one of my favorite wrestlers of the era. And let's see. Let's try. A lot of these guys are people I don't know, even though I was still a wrestling fan to an extent at this time. He looks like he's milquetoast enough. We'll try it. Norman Smiley. Now, this game was not well received when it came out. It, again, was released in '99 for the Nintendo 64 and the PS1. Came out the following year for the Game Boy Color. The PS1 version is the highest rated overall at 73% according to Game Rankings, 68% Nintendo 64, 64% Game Boy Color. And the reviews of this game were that because it has a lack of decent character moves, the collision detection is not great, the physics is not good, that by comparison to the WWE games that came out in competition with WCW around this time, and these were the last WCW games to get made before Vince McMahon bought WCW from Ted Turner in the early 2000s. And we immediately go for a pin, which we shouldn't have done. So how this game works is you've got to be able to lock up your opponent.
That's all he got out of that one. I'm kind of surprised he tried that move there. Russian leg sweep.
And then be able to pull off different moves. And because the Nintendo 64 controller had so many different buttons and joysticks and stuff on it, part of the issue is with the game is trying to get a controller mapped out so you can actually execute the stuff that you want to be able to do. And that is something that I've seen happen way too often, both with wrestling games, and I think it's a byproduct of fighting games. In that, because you had so many fighting games who were taking advantage of joysticks and different button combinations and movement combinations, trying to make things seem more fluid and give each character more opportunity to do different stuff. While that works great in a fighting game to a greater degree or not, depending on the game, in a wrestling game, that's not always necessarily a good thing. which speaks to why I still hold to my thesis of the original NES Pro Wrestling being still the greatest wrestling game of all time. And it's not because I don't like licensed wrestling or games, or because I'm anti-WWE, or I'm, whatever. I was, until I was about 15. Ooh, Bret Hart gets put in the sharpshooter. That's not something you see very often.
I'd have to say that he's been stunned by what's gone on so far.
I grew up watching when WWE was still the WWF. The WCW was still the NWA, which it is outside the U.S., but you had other promotions like the AWA, which was really it was definitely very much the third tier, and it was on its way out by the late 80s. Like, when, once Hulk Hogan left the AWA to go to New York and work for Vince McMahon, the writing was on the wall that it was going to be not around much longer. And the AWA, I think, folded by, I think, no later than the early 90s. And by then, you had what are called the Monday Night Wars between WCW and WWE over who controlled programming on Monday nights. WCW had Nitro, WWE obviously had Monday Night Raw. And that, for my mid-adolescence, still had enough of an interest to me that it was something that I would watch fairly often. And people have asked me, what is the appeal of wrestling? Why do people like pro wrestling? And it's a soap opera. It is a male testosterone-driven soap opera. It's the same reason why my mom and my grandmother, and even some of my older male siblings to a degree, watched soap operas during the week and watched wrestling on the weekends. My mom and my grandmother didn't, but my grandfathers watched wrestling. And it's, if you can get people interested in the storylines that the promoters and the wrestlers put together, that's where you draw people in. And that was where it depended on what you were wanting. Because you can make the argument that, like him or hate him, Vince McMahon was a genius in terms of being able to create characters that were going to get people's attention for good or bad. I mean, he made Hulk Hogan an icon in the 80s, and then allowed, during the Attitude Era, guys like Steve Austin and Triple H and The Rock and Shawn Michaels to give it that edge that was going into the 90s when my generation was coming up, and we had that edge. We were still really angry, and we were at that stage as teenagers where we were rebelling against everything. And rather than staying with the 80s action hero mold that he had built with Hogan and Randy Savage and guys like the Ultimate Warrior and whatnot, McMahon had the presence of mind to go, okay, we need to evolve, and that's what he did. And WCW, in the meantime, was doing something similar, but they were doing it with stars who were having to carry over from when they were at their best in the 80s. Guys like Ric Flair and the Four Horsemen, and you had guys like Sting and Lex Luger and all that stuff. So it was all a question of what do you fancy.
He's in a bit of trouble after that one. Going for the pin.
And we were able to pin him.
He's
Now, I will tell you, this match took about 10 minutes to get done. I had actually recorded an episode prior to this where I utilized Goldberg and I think it was DDP. And the match went nearly 25 minutes. The episode ran about 10 minutes longer than I had planned it to run. And I eventually pulled the ripcord on it because it was just so nuts that we could not get the match to end. Or no, it was Goldberg versus Booker T was who we had. So let's see. We've got about 20 minutes left. So let's pick another match here. Well, we'll take Randy Savage. And I'll put him against Sting. See what we got here. Two icons of sports entertainment. Let's see what we can do. Now, the highest grade that this game got was on IGN. It got an 8.5 out of 10. GameFan gave it a 82%. But EGM gave it a 5.5. Game Informer a 7.5. Game Revolution rated it a D+. Next Generation gave it 1 out of 5. Their review was particularly brutal, where they said, quote, if this game existed in a total vacuum, it would barely pass. But in the face of WrestleMania 2000 and even WWE Attitude, it's simply excusable. And, ooh, snap suplex. The reason why WCW went with EA for this game was a bit of, it all ties back again to the Monday Night Wars. Because WWE was getting beaten at one point by WCW in terms of ratings and fan interest and all that stuff. WWE decided that they ended their long partnership with Acclaim Entertainment, who had made for over a decade all of WWE's wrestling video games, and with, I think, very, very minor exception, they're all crap. I'm not saying that just to be shallow about it. I'm saying it because in trying to determine which games I want to play for both this and Suckerpunch Sunday, which I do hope you tune into tomorrow, I do have to test out certain games. One, to see if they work on my emulators. And I am, again, using Project 64 as my emulator of choice for this game. And I've played at least half a dozen WWE titles. And the Acclaim games are just, they're truly bad. The mechanics are awful. The movesets are terrible. As I taunt Sting and he drop kicks me for my effort. Ooh, puts me in the Scorpion Deathlock. But Macho Man didn't submit. And now Sting's getting a chair. I still can't lock him up, and I still can't be able to pull any decent moves off.
Just about had the win right there. Now he must be quite confident if he's talking this much.
Russian leg sweep.
That move looked like it wounded him.
The difficult thing is that with the N64 controller, it is having to shift between... Ooh, suplex. I've been on the receiving end of quite a few of those, as have many of the beds that I had lived on. Ooh, we already got taken down. Well, that one didn't last very long.
Fans, an absolute mess. I mean, an absolute mess of a match. We can only hope.
It was a mess of a match. And that's part of the problem, is that because you're having to operate between your movement stick, which on this game, since the N64 controller came with one joystick, that doesn't work. You have to use the D-pad. And then in order to be able to pull a move off, you need to have access to a D-pad, because you had your A and B button on the 64, but then you also had a secondary set of buttons opposite the D-pad, which was called the C-pad. And you need to be able to access those along with the A button and a move button to pull moves off. Now think about this for a minute. You need one button to execute a move. You need a thumb to be able to operate a secondary button to be able to pull the move off once you've locked up. And you need a control stick or a D-pad to be able to point in the direction to tell the controller which move it's doing. You need 3 hands and potentially 4 thumbs to play this game. Whereas if you play it on the PS1, which did not have the DualShock at the time, you were having to go by what was on the D-pad, but then hoping that you could still do the same thing in getting your wrestler to do what you want. Now, it is in doing another review, the D-pad destroyer said you have a choice here. If you're into arts and moves, then WCW may leave you dazed by its simplicity. But if you watch wrestling for the show in action, then Mayhem's right up your alley. It's fast, simple, action-paced, and it's the body slam on the PlayStation. Which begs the question of why are we not playing it on the PS1? Well, part of it is that I've been playing a lot of PlayStation games, PS1 and PS2 alike, and I don't want to leave the Nintendo 64 high and dry. The other thing is that because there was nothing when I put this series together that said I was only going to play the best sports games. Sometimes in order to highlight how great one game is, you have to play a lesser version of the same genre. And that's what I'm doing here. So hopefully this last match, we'll see what we can do with Goldberg, who was probably my favorite last wrestler of the era, against Buff Bagwell, who was just... There was nothing about him I found interesting at all. He was just a walking pile of steroids and overloaded testosterone. Do the gorilla press. Do the gorilla press again. Oh, we flipped this over. Oh, tried the spear, and that didn't work. Now, I liked Goldberg for his charisma in that he came into wrestling very much as a force of nature. The problem is that technically he was not good. He was very much like Hulk Hogan in the idea that Hogan always said he had 3 moves. He had the punch, he had the big boot, and then he had the leg drop. That was it. And I, very much being a smaller guy, I always liked seeing guys who could move around the ring and execute certain moves. Like, my favorite wrestler of all time is most likely, if I really had to choose one who, if I want to be able to go back and watch, is Ricky the Dragon Steamboat. Ricky Steamboat, and you ask anybody who was in the business in the 80s, even the 70s when he broke in, all the way through to the 90s when his career was winding down. And there was nobody who can really say a bad word about Ricky Steamboat. And obviously that's not his real name. His name is Richard Blood, if you want to believe that. A guy who with potentially a great wrestling name, but was very much a man who looked like a buffer version at the time of Bruce Lee. It seemed more exotic to the powers that be in wrestling at the time to give him a slightly less sinister last name, for lack of a better term. And Ricky Steamboat was always a guy who came off as a hero. He was, or at least in terms of what they used to refer to back in the day, as a babyface. He was a good guy. And he was a good guy his entire career. So he was an easy guy to root for. But technically, he could do everything. There was nothing that he was not able to achieve in the ring. And you watch interviews on YouTube with guys like Ric Flair, the Anderson brothers, Bret Hart, anybody who knows anything about what it takes to be good as a professional wrestler. None of them have a bad word to say about Ricky Steamboat.
What is this? He's picked up a chair. Gorilla press. He's not getting up. He may be hurt.
And one of the things about that era was that if you were a WCW fan, they were a bit more technically minded. They had the over-the-top stuff like guys like Buff Bagwell and whatnot, but they knew that they couldn't compete with Vince McMahon, who was the king of all that. His whole thing was over-the-top stuff that people in New York were like, I wouldn't see this anywhere else. That's why he could pack Madison Square Garden with guys like Bruno Sammartino, but also guys who nowadays you couldn't get away with because there were racial stereotype after racial stereotype after racial stereotype. You know, people don't seem to forget about the fact that a guy like Jimmy Snuka, who was listed as the wild man from Fiji, I believe he was actually from New Jersey. But he was a big guy who fit the role. And that's what he did, and that's how he sold. And Vince McMahon was able to sell that to the New York crowd as very much like you would going to see somebody at a circus. And that's where professional wrestling got its start, was vaudeville and the circus and all that stuff back in the early 1900s. And people don't think about that nowadays because it's a multi-billion-dollar business that they turned it into. So we didn't manage to win that one, but in that respect, I mean, I'm going to call this one a no contest because it wasn't about trying to, like I do with football and baseball and basketball games, seeing what we can do to actually beat the game or beat the opponent. This was one where I wanted to see if it's a game that holds up, which it doesn't. Is it as good as the best games of the genre? It isn't. And to me, it seems indicative of what we've seen over the last 20 years with a lot of wrestling games, where it is far more style over substance. And I know even a couple of years ago, when EA took over as the sole creator of the WWE games, how they just are getting worse and worse. I think it was it WCW, or not, WWE, was it 2021 or 22 that had, I saw the YouTube videos about it where it had so many bugs, and it was just so unplayable that it's impacting how people who have been fans and want to be fans of wrestling, they're not making the investments they did when I was their age and still into this stuff. But that, everybody, is WCW Mayhem from 1999 for the Nintendo 64. Again, is it a great game? Not even close. Is it the best wrestling game? No. My thesis still stands that NES Pro Wrestling remains the greatest wrestling game ever made. If you disagree with me or you want to point me in a direction one that you think is better, leave it in the comments below. Drop me a line. Tell me which ones you think are better than that. But I'll put that up against this one or any of the contemporary games any day, and I likes my chances. So if you've enjoyed this, and I do hope you have, the easiest way to show it is hit that like button, subscribe to the channel if you are new, ring the bell to be notified of the latest content. We do have Suckerpunch Sunday coming up tomorrow, where we will play a classic fighting or fighting platform-based game from the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th generation. And I have an idea that the one I pick and the one we play will be a lot better than this one for sure. Also, we do have our newest playthrough that will be getting started on Monday. I've been hinting at it. It is a PlayStation game, which was, again, another reason why I wanted to play a Nintendo 64 game this week. But it is not a PlayStation game that you would commonly associate with that system. That's been the hint I've been giving you, and we'll see how many people think they are right in guessing which one it will be when it premieres on Monday. Be sure to follow us on Instagram at Ronan's Retrocade and help spread the word about us. That way we can hit our goal of 100 YouTube subscribers as soon as we can. The faster we do that, the faster we unlock the customization algorithm, and we can make this channel bigger and better. And as always, if there's a game you would like to see us feature from the Nintendo Entertainment System, the Super Nintendo, Sega Master System, Sega Genesis or Mega Drive, SNK Neo-Geo, Nintendo 64, PlayStation 1, or PlayStation 2, leave it in the comments below or drop me a line on Instagram. It could be any game from those consoles that you want. And as always, my name's Ronan. It's been great to spend this Sports Saturday with you. Be safe, be well, have a happy, safe, and cool 4th of July weekend wherever you may be. And we'll talk to you again tomorrow for Suckerpunch Sunday. Bye.